Well, we do our best to try to define everything in our plans and in our specifications using standard items. Again, that's easier for contractors to understand and for us to be able to inspect and know what we're looking for, in particular on a job. Most jobs do have some adjustments to that standard kind of job. You'll find those adjustments listed and discussed in things called supplemental conditions. In this case, often you'll find special provisions and special specifications depending on the agency and the common practice in the area. But in our case, we're going to spend some time looking at supplemental conditions for our project. As you can see, there are a number of items in the supplemental conditions section of a proposal, including contract specifications, modifications to general conditions, and general conditions are usually boilerplate front ends that come with most contracts, either public or private. We're going to talk a little bit about modifications to APWA Kansas City Metro standards, where we aren't using the standard listed in the APWA book. And then there's definitions for a number of other items. One of the important things is that supplemental conditions often show you where there are changes from that standard, and the standard such as defined in the means cost estimating. So if you're going to use a means, you need to make sure you understand the supplemental conditions and what they're saying. So almost more than any other piece of the contract, once you're done looking at the plans, you read the supplemental conditions and you memorize what's there, or mark up your plans so that you know where there are change from what you might expect to a standard. Also, as you go into the means estimating software, you're going to compare what the means definition is to the supplemental condition or any special specifications definition. Again, if they're different, then you're going to have to modify the means program to be able to account for those differences. You start out again with a lot of definitions, and that's really what the supplemental conditions are doing. They're defining the work, and they're telling you where you start and what changes there are. So in this case, you'll see right up front that the contract specifications is that we conform to the latest edition of the Kansas City APWA specifications. Everything else after that are where you vary or where we have to change those specifications to suit our job. You'll see a number of listings that talk about payment procedures that you have to follow, the way you're going to work on special items. When we get to section C in particular, you'll see its modifications to those specifications, and it's going to go section by section talking about where the change is. You'll see, for example, C.1, it talks about clearing, grubbing, and demolition. And in this case, it's talking about an addition to that specification that will be applied to this contract. And what's important are two things. First, the additional language or the change in the language. And secondly, how the payment for that piece of work is going to be changed. Whether you're going to be able to add extra payment or the units that you'll be paying may be changed. One of the things we have to remember using means is that you have to make sure that the unit that is in means that you're going to calculate ends up corresponding to the unit first in the proposal, and the proposal ties back to the specifications, either these supplemental condition specifications or the APWA specifications. You see that there are a number of other items. Again, they all follow the same format. We're going to talk about the section that is applicable. Then it's going to talk about any additions to that section that are going to change, any deletions to that section, And then if there's a cost associated with that item, it's going to tell you if there's a change to the cost and also the units, and often it'll define the units that you cost. In other words, it'll say X dollars each, X dollars per cubic yard, X dollars per square yard of 4-inch concrete. So the supplemental conditions often are the vehicle used when you want to use a cost item that's more comfortable or standard practice in your agency. Every agency accounts for the items differently. There's a lot of similarity, but again, each agency is unique, so you have to make sure that you're, for example, when you're looking at sidewalk, that you can calculate a cost, or cost may be payable in cubic yards of concrete placed, or cubic yards or square yards of a given thickness, 4-inch or 6-inch concrete placed. The supplemental conditions in this project also account for a number of items, and we're going to talk a little more about those, that are in things like overhead or that affect your profit factor. So again, you'll see insurance, and insurance has to be accounted for. You have to buy insurance, you have to prove you have insurance. So somewhere in your project you have to capture the cost to pay for that insurance, otherwise you end up losing money. Sometimes these are buried again in an overhead. Sometimes they're allocated among each of the units a certain way. For us, we probably are going to be looking at burying it in an overhead factor and not rolling it into each unit price. But again, that depends on how your particular organization wants to look at it. The important thing is that the cost has to be accounted for if you're going to make money. You'll see such things as how correspondence is traded. In some projects you want to burn items, brush or trees to get rid of them, and in this case it's not permitted inside the city. It talks about things like blasting. Work hours. Work hours are important, in particular as you look at work days, work time. There may be limits, and the special provisions or the supplemental conditions will tell you if there are limits. Sometimes there's no work on weekends or holidays, like as we're talking here, and that affects your scheduling. It affects how many hours in a day for you to work. It also talks about things like construction staking, and for construction staking, more and more that is left to the contractor to handle. It used to be that the owner would provide construction staking, but the liability also then was the owner's. Now, in modern construction staking is often the responsibility of the contractor, and so they have the risk if they make a mistake. It'll be checked by the owner, but it's the contractor's risk, also the contractor's cost. You'll find, especially on federal aid projects like we have here, there may be requirements for buying products that are made in America. And as a contractor, what that means to you is sometimes it limits your supplier. You can't always go with the lowest suppliers, even if they are lowest, if they're not made in America and it's required. Not everything is required to be made in America. What you'll usually find is things like steel and iron components, castings for manholes, inlets, steel for trusses, for example, often will specify being American made, and there's extra documentation that goes along with this work. Again, it's a cost that probably gets buried in your overhead somewhere, but you need to have things like mill certifications proving steel, for example, is made in the United States. So you have to have a piece of paper that says it was made in this mill located in this place. A lot of paperwork for you to deal with. Again, it goes on, talks about subgrade, it talks about seasons when you can do planting, especially on a project like ours. There's planting of grass, sod, trees, other plant material, and it'll give dates when you may or may not plant. And when you're doing your scheduling, you're going to have to account for that. If it says you can't plant grass in July, and your schedule shows your project coming to grass planting starting in July, you need to adjust your schedule, adjust the work somehow so that you can plant grass in the proper time. Otherwise, you can go ahead and plant. Often, I certainly won't stop you as the owner. But if the plant all dies, or the grass all dies, I'm going to make you plant it at your own cost. Often contractors will do that. It's a good soil erosion practice means you cover open grade, but they also understand that they have to come back, and it's not a question that you get an extra or you get to be paid twice. You get paid once for the work. Anything else you do is up to you. So the question is, do you change schedules, or do you do something else so that you meet the proper planning time frame? Again, a number of items we talk about: concrete curing, disposal of materials, how it's going to be cleaned up, where it's going to go, testing of concrete, the subgrade, sewers, asphalt. These are rules that you need to worry about, and again, it'll tell you what we're going to be looking at. We're going to do testing on a random basis throughout the job. Before we pay you for a piece of work, we're going to test that work, and so you have to know when we're testing. And in the case of this project, you have to make cylinders for concrete, for example, or you have to do certain types of proctor tests for subgrade and placement, so we know density. You also have to know how often we take tests so that you have the proper tickets, and all the tickets have to be marked in a special way to denote that this is Grandview's project and that it's a federal aid project. And if you don't have the paperwork marked properly with our name and project numbers and all the federal IDs, you don't get paid. We don't accept the work until you come up with the work or you do it over again. You'll see in this case we talk about fencing, and we have quite an extensive specification that talks about, again, what needs to be done, and that starts with the scope. Then it talks about the fence type. Then it talks about materials. And often what you'll see in a specification is tables showing different components of that piece of work and what specifications they meet. In this case, you'll see that there's certain ASTM schedules that have to be met, or other tests or measurements that we're going to be looking for and we could check before we accept the work. You'll also see that we look at things. There's a definition here for gate. Gate's a specialty item. They change. How the fence is installed is a specialty item. Again, we're going to tell you how far we want things like posts, or how high it is, how deep it has to be set into the ground, so that you know exactly. And you can expect that at least once or twice during a project, when you're doing a piece of work, for example, putting up fence wherever it's needed, is that when our inspector's on the job, we're going to be looking for these items, and we're going to want some verification that the project, in this case fence, was built this way before we'll approve payment for that item. Again, you'll see that it closes out by talking about measurements and payments. Again, sometimes this is split up among each of the items, or it's discussed in each of the items, and then it's reiterated for you to remember. Okay, but it'll tell you special conditions or things to look out for. In this case, it talks about some seeding and sodding items. It talks about soil erosion and sedimentation control, an ordinance that you have to meet. It's a city's ordinance, but you have to comply with the ordinance. That's what we expect. If you need a permit, then you need the permit, and you have to roll the cost of the permit into your work somewhere. So many of these items involve costs that you have to try to recoup in your job. Again, whether you roll it into the cost of the item, we're going to talk about that more as we look at the mean schedule, but also it may be an overhead, or it may be rolled into your profits somewhere, or a handling charge that you may charge to different things. So again, the supplemental specifications are one of the most important things you have. They call your attention to changes to the standards. If you work in the Kansas City area, you probably know the APWA standards quite well, or the MoDOT standards. And most people use most of those items, but not everybody uses all those items. In fact, very few organizations use all those items, and whenever they vary from those items, or they have an item that isn't listed in the APWA specification, you're going to find it in the supplemental conditions. And if you find an item that isn't listed in the supplemental conditions, then you need to question or submit a question to the owner before bid time. Once you bid and commit a price, then that's what you live with. And if you have a question, there's no dumb questions when you're trying to get a bid together. You ask the question so that you have the best and clearest information, so that you can make a firm bid that, first of all, you can live with, but secondly, as a contractor, you can make money with. As an owner, I'm interested in my contractors making their profit and doing reasonably well in a project. It's only fair that you do that, but I'm also not going to pay you if you don't take the time or have the sense to know what the job is very well. If you're going to lose money because you aren't careful, that's your problem, not mine. So read the supplemental conditions.